Great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Andrew Whitehead. The heading in WOW was London's most sensational shootout, which I thought was quite a vigorous heading. 1911, we're talking about Stepney and Latvian emigres who were responsible for a shootout in Stepney. And I thought when I read about it, you know, it was not the beginning of that sort of thing, and it certainly isn't the end. It was somewhere midway, I guess. So it's very relevant to today, I'm sure. So I'd like to hand over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that. What Paula was just saying about bodies in burning buildings, well, there's an echo of that in what I'm going to be telling you about in the next 45 minutes. But first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Paula and to iU3A here in Islington, my home borough, for inviting me here today. I've done a number of walks with iU3A with Anne and colleagues, and it's lovely to be invited back here. And thank you for turning up in such numbers. And thank you also for bringing me back to Jones Brothers. So I was asking what this building was built for, and I think Jill did a bit of checking and said this used to be Jones Brothers. I remember Jones Brothers as a department store when I first moved to North London, and I've just checked now when Jones Brothers closed at the end of no successful campaign to save it. I'd have said about 20 years ago, but I was wrong. 34. It was July 1990. So that shows my age. But what I'm going to talk about now, today, is something that stretches much further back, as Paula mentioned, to 1911. And I'm going to start, I've written a book about it, which is what you see on the screen at the moment. I'm going to start with a quote from the Home Secretary of the day in 1911, who said, quote, "Nothing of the sort had been seen within living memory in quiet, law-abiding, comfortable England." Well, don't know what you think about the rather cloying lyricism of that quote, but in essence, he was right. This was, and I would justify the term, the most sensational shootout in London's history. Sydney Street, in Stepney, in what was then the mainly Jewish East End of London, 3rd of January 1911, two emigre gunmen, basically Latvian anarchists, who managed to keep armed police and then army sharpshooters at bay for fully 6 hours. 6 hours of fairly incessant gunfire, during which, as best as I can tell, about 1,000 bullets were fired. And it followed on from an attempt by the Latvians to burrow into a jeweller's shop in Hansditch in the City of London, near Liverpool Street Station. And they were interrupted by the police as they were trying to get into the jeweller's shop. And the Latvians shot their way out, and they shot dead 3 police officers and seriously wounded 2 others. It was, and it remains, the worst single incident in the history of the police in London. And it was 2 of the men wanted for those police murders who had taken refuge in Sydney Street. And the shootout was a sensation in the press. The popular press was just getting into gear. New printing meant you got mass circulation papers selling for a halfpenny or a penny, and new technology also meant that action photographs, rather than simply portrait photographs, could appear in the next day's paper. So this is the battle with the London anarchists. A compendium of photographs and reports that appeared in the Daily Chronicle, one of the main daily papers of the time, and it's described as the only complete account of the Hansditch tragedies and the historic siege of foreign anarchists in the East End of London. I mean, slightly souped up and sensational, published within 72 hours for a penny. That's an old penny, which of course is Help me now. So the 240 pence. So it was 0.4 of a current penny. In other words, it wasn't very much at all. And this sold in the tens of thousands. You can still, they're collected, but you can, find copies of this online, which is where I got my copy. And the drama of the siege in Sydney Street also attracted an absolutely brand new news platform. The newsreel, cinematic newsreel, silent of course, had started in France a couple of years earlier, and a few months before, in 1910, it moved to London, and there were a number of newsreel companies. They normally did arts events at that time. They didn't really do breaking news stories because actually the cameras were always in the wrong place. But when you had a drama of this sort, which stretched over several hours, just 2 or 3 miles from the centre of London, journalists from Fleet Street made a beeline to Sydney Street. They actually managed to get a vantage point for the action on the roof of a local pub. The publican charged them a sovereign each to get access to his roof. I reckon that he probably made, in today's money, £2,500 without serving a drink. Okay, and some of the cinematographers got up onto the roof as well. Others were at ground level. 5 cinematographers that were there. 3 of their films survived, and some of them are available on YouTube. And some of their footage was being shown in cinemas in central London that same evening. So it was a moment of great change in the media, and this drama fed that change and fed the appetite for, it's got everything. It's sensational, it's immediate, it's got that sort of who are these people in the East End element. It's got guns, it's a shootout, the police are there, the army are there. And this is the Home Secretary I was talking about, and I quoted from. Here he is in his silk hat, in his mid-30s at the time, Home Secretary. We think of him as a conservative, but in a liberal government at this time. This is Winston Churchill. When the siege was happening, he was impatient, he couldn't find out what was happening. Scotland Yard were telling him virtually nothing. He had a military background, he had fought and killed in Sudan, he'd been a war correspondent during the Boer War, and he wanted to live up to that reputation, as a man of action. So he went to the scene in Sydney Street. There he is amid a Scots Guard, detectives, uniformed police, and a fire brigade officer. More about that later. Of course, he admitted later it was the wrong thing to do. It was terribly rash, because you've already got City of London Police, Metropolitan Police, and Army there, and then their political boss, in essence, turns up, who is operational in command. He completely upturned the conventional chain of command in a live operation. And he said afterwards, I just went there to observe, I wasn't giving directions. But journalists who were within earshot of him said, he spent all his time giving directions. Do that, go there, come back. And he had plans to storm the building using steel plates to try and deflect any bullets that might have been directed at those storming the building. He asked for sappers to be brought in case troops wanted to go through the roof of the building or through the wall from the next door building. So to say that he wasn't actually giving instruction is to be, let's call it a half-truth, quarter truth. And this is the other person whose name is most associated with the siege of Sydney Street of 1911. I don't know whether anybody would like to hazard a guess who this is. This is Peter the Painter. Peter the Painter, bit of an East End anti-hero. He was a Latvian and an anarchist, certainly in London at the time, and he was seen to be, probably rather misleading, the mastermind of the Latvian anarchists. He was a prominent Latvian anarchist, and he was probably in London not to take part in the robbery, but actually to take any proceeds, either jewels or if they were fenced, cash out of Britain to fund the revolutionary Latvian movement in the Baltic states. He sort of disappeared after the Siege of Sydney Street, which added to the legend of Peter the Painter. But people think of anarchists at the early years of last century as being lumpen, scruffy, down at heel, bearded, frayed overcoat, boots with holes in, that sort of type of figure. And here he is with a Hercule Poirot moustache, very elegantly cut hair, well-dressed, tie, suit, posing for what's clearly a portrait studio photograph. The London police got this from the police in Marseille. Peter the Painter, when he left Latvia, spent time in the United States and then France before coming to London. Quite an elegant guy. And it tells you a little bit about who the Latvian anarchists were. They were largely young, well-educated, radical Latvians who were impatient both for greater social justice and also impatient to get rid of rule from the Russian Tsar. Latvia at that time felt itself to be a nation. It had its own language. It is now an independent nation, but it was ruled as part of the Tsar's Russian Empire, and there was a great deal of resentment about that. And the police issued reward posters. Here they're using one of Peter the Painter's many pseudonyms. £500 reward. In today's money, that's £60,000. So these were big reward sums to try and get information about who the Latvians were and to locate the people who were held responsible for the murder of the 3 police officers in the failed jewellery attempt. And as far as the London police are concerned, even to this day, who Peter the Painter is supposed to be as much a mystery as who that other East End anti-hero, Jack the Ripper, actually is. They operated in much the same area. They both have similarly, Peter the Painter as a pseudonym, which was a name given to him by the police, a translation of a Latvian nickname, but very alliterative. It clearly, in the name, it bears a very distinct echo of Jack the Ripper. In fact, the police, by the end of 1912, knew who Peter the Painter was. They knew his name, Janis Zaklis. They knew the location of the family farm in Latvia. They didn't know where he was. They thought he might be in Germany, but they had insufficient evidence to either convict or extradite. So basically they stopped looking. But they never publicly acknowledged that they knew who he was. And when, during the First World War, police in Australia got in touch and said, "We've arrested a Latvian, we think he's Peter the Painter, what do we do?" The London police said, "We're not interested." Whether the Australian police have got the right guy, I don't know. Odds against, but it's not impossible. But whatever, the police in London just weren't interested. Even if it was their man, they just didn't have the evidence to take any further action. This is I rather like this photograph. It's a group of Latvian anarchists in Latvia, though 2 of them, central figures, man and woman, spent time in London as well. After the police murders, the British consul in Riga, the Latvian capital, was provided with this photograph to pass on to the London police who were investigating, because it was believed that some of these people might have been involved. And again, young, smartly dressed, rather confident in the way that they are looking at the camera. And why Latvian anarchism? And why Latvian anarchists in London? Well, basically in 1905, there was a failed revolution in Russia. It started in St. Petersburg. It spread very quickly to Latvia, which is not that far away. And it became a really powerful mass movement. And on one occasion, tens of thousands of Latvians took to the streets of Riga demanding an end to the Tsar and social justice, and they were dispersed by security forces who opened fire. And to get away from the bullets, lots of the demonstrators went on to the ice-covered river that flows through Riga. I think you could probably guess what happens next. The ice gave way and more than 200 of the demonstrators drowned. And there's still a huge Soviet-era monument by the river in Riga to those dead. And that sort of helped to shape the sort of anger of the movement in Latvia, and a lot of people of this age, radicals, impatient for change, felt that actually if the security forces are going to open fire on us, they're going to deploy Cossacks, who were notoriously among the most vicious of the Tsar's security forces. Cossacks were noted for torture, arbitrary execution, sexual violence. Then some of the youngsters involved thought the only way we can combat that is if we take up arms ourselves. So they bought actually quite powerful automatic pistols in black markets in Helsinki and in Antwerp, and they started firing back. Over a course of a couple of years, a quarter of Riga's police force died. It wasn't a very big police force, but nevertheless to lose 25%, mainly in clashes with left-wing protesters. But when the Tsar, in response to the protests, opened the door, a little bit of liberalisation, perhaps we'll have some elections to a Russian-wide parliament, some strands in the left thought, okay, let's go for that. Other strands said, no, we don't trust the Tsar, we don't want to go down an electoral route. And they basically rallied under the anarchist flag. It was very much a minority, but it was quite an active minority. And they also practiced armed robbery, wages, banks, to fund their own movement. And they believed that what they called revolutionary expropriation was politically justified. The end justified the means. But by the end of 1906, more than 2,000 young Latvians had been forced into exile to escape imprisonment or arbitrary, the risk of torture or execution. In France, Germany, the United States, and here in the UK, there were groups of Latvian exiles. A few of them, and they spoke Latvian, they spoke Russian, some would have spoken German, very few spoke English. So they were largely cocooned in groups who also had the same background. And a few of them, a minority, maybe just a few dozen, carried on practicing the same style of politics they had in the Baltic states in their new homes, which included staging armed robberies to raise money for their movement. And so that's how we ended up with a small number of Latvian anarchists. Active numbers, probably 20 in Britain in 1909, 1910, 1911. There were similar groups in the United States and Germany, also staging armed crime. But in the East End, I mean, the Latvian anarchists were largely not Jewish, a few were, most weren't. But when they moved to London, they moved to the East End of London because that's where new immigrants moved to. And the East End, over the previous 20 years, had become the home of tens of thousands of Jewish migrants from Eastern Europe escaping religious persecution. The western side of the borough of Stepney was, by this date, 80% Jewish, so it was a very much Jewish area. The Jewish migrants had themselves a very active anarchist movement. This is a photograph of some of them. The guy with the glasses there is a guy called Rudolf Rocker, a German Gentile who was the leading figure in the Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement in the East End. He was the editor of the paper, Der Arbeiterblatt, the Workers' Friend, which had a print run of 4,000, a political weekly paper in Yiddish in 1910, 1911. 4,000 is a lot of copies. And they had their own club. That's a drawing of it, a disused church, in Jubilee Street in Stepney, just parallel to Sydney Street. And that club had a meeting room, probably about this size actually, it could take several hundred people, and it had a library, and it had a cafe, and it had offices, and it had a printing press. That's where the paper was actually produced and printed. The Latvians, when they moved to London, I should say that Rocker and his colleagues did not approve of revolutionary violence. Well, they might have approved of it in the throes of a revolution, but they certainly didn't approve of armed robbery or assassination or shooting policemen. They strongly disapproved. But their club was open to anybody. And the Latvians who came to London used that club, in essence, as their base. It's where they attended concerts. It's where they could speak to people in their own language. It's where they could read the press from back home. It's where they had a cafe which sold familiar food. And it's where they hatched quite a few of their plans. So although they weren't part of the flow of the East End anarchist movement, they were also attached to it in some ways. And as far as what the Latvians did in terms of armed robberies, of course, we don't know about all the robberies which were successful because they wouldn't have used their guns and they got clean away. There are obviously quite a few else they wouldn't have kept on doing it. We know that there was one unsuccessful one in Motherwell in 1908. In the same year, there was the Tottenham outrage, where two armed Latvian anarchists tried to snatch wages money being delivered to a rubber reclamation plant on Tottenham High Street. They actually succeeded, fired a few shots. The bag was, all the money, £80, was in coins. There were no pound notes at that time. So it would have weighed quite a lot, and they grabbed it and ran. Their planning was suboptimal. So the rubber reclamation plant was immediately opposite Tottenham Police Station, which was a big police station. More than that, on the top floor there was a section house where young unmarried officers could bed down. So when inside the police station they heard the commotion on the street outside, the police jumped through doors and windows to pursue the robbers. They did so, of course, unarmed. And the robbers made their way, probably not by design, across, zigzagged through Tottenham back streets, got to Tottenham Marshes, crossed the River Lee, ran through Walthamstow Marshes, every so often turning and firing a few shots to discourage their pursuers, who were not just the police, but lots of folks who joined in the fun of the chase, including a bunch of duck hunters on the marshes who trained their lead shot on the robbers. By the time they got to Walthamstow, the two Latvians were knackered, so they hijacked a tram. The police then hijacked another tram, commandeered another tram, and told it to go in reverse in pursuit of the original tram. So the Latvians, I'm not making this up, I'm really not making this up. So the two Latvians jumped off the tram and hijacked a horse-drawn milk cart, but they couldn't disengage the brake. They didn't know how to disengage the brake on the wheels. So they jumped off and hijacked a vegetable seller's cart, pursued by a donkey, pulled by a donkey. So in the end, the Latvians basically were cornered. One shot himself and died from the injuries. The other hid in a room actually near Epping Forest in, I can't remember the name of the street to be honest, but there's a plaque to mark the spot. And he died. It's not entirely clear whether he was shot by armed police or whether he killed himself. So both Latvians died. It was farcical, but actually 4 people in total died, so it was also tragic. In the course of the pursuit, the 2 Latvians killed a police constable and also a 10-year-old boy who was on his Saturday Baker's delivery rounds, who probably joined in the fun. But in just before Christmas 1910, a group of Latvian anarchists staged a much more formidable attempt to break into this jewellery shop at Houndsditch. Harris's jewellery shop. So Houndsditch, as I say, leads from Bishopsgate towards Aldgate in the East End. In the safe at the back of the shop was jewellery which was worth, by today's prices, about £1 million, just short of £1 million. So, this promised, compared to the £10,000 or so in today's prices that they might have got from the wages robbery, this was a big haul. And the group was very well prepared. They had not just hammers and picks and stuff like that, but they had cutting equipment and a gas cylinder and tubing. So this was formidable. And what they did is, this is Exchange Buildings. And the left-hand side of what you're looking at, which is a dead end, by the way, backed onto Houndsditch. So the Latvians rented a house, actually the house where that woman is peering out from, rented it, moved people in there to give the impression that it was occupied, and then planned to excavate actually through the wall of the outside toilet, which was a party wall to the back of the jeweller's shop. This was a Jewish area, so the jeweller's shop and all the other local businesses closed on Friday afternoon and didn't open again until Sunday morning. So the would-be robbers started work late on a Friday night, thinking they probably had 36 hours to get in there, break the safe, clear it out, and run. But they hadn't, again, the planning probably was not great because the Jewish Sabbath, is a moment of quiet and reflection. There's not a lot of noise. People don't socialise. So when you hear tap, 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 clap, 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 bang, 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 people think, it's very noticeable. And one of the neighbours, late on Friday night, was so suspicious that he went out on the street looking for a uniformed police constable to report his concerns to. And this was the era that if you went out on the streets on a Friday night and walked along a little bit, you had a good chance of finding a uniformed police constable. And he did. And the police constable very naively walked around the area. He realised where the banging was coming from, so he knocked on the door of the Property and Exchange Buildings. But he didn't know what he was going to say, so the door was opened, face peered out. Police constable said, "Is the missus in?" Don't think he was heading for the CID somehow. But, and the guy said, "No." And the police constable said, "Okay, I'll come back later." And went back to the police station in Bishopsgate to report his concerns, because clearly he was suspicious that there may have been an attempt to break into the jewels. Strangely, the Latvians involved, and there were probably 4 or 5 of them in the building, having been rumbled, didn't do a runner. They carried on trying to break into the jewels. I don't know whether that's stupidity or conceit or what, but they did. Or maybe the fact that they had guns and they knew that the police were unarmed gave them a certain sense of invincibility. But 40 minutes later, 9 police officers, all unarmed, were in Exchange Buildings and in Houndsditch, believing that they were about to interrupt a robbery. A sergeant, again, knocked on the door in Exchange Buildings. The door was opened by the same man, who then backed off. The sergeant took 1 step into the room. Another person came down the internal staircase with a pistol and started firing, immediately hitting the sergeant. And then all the people in the house, probably 4 or 5, 3 of whom had guns, having to go through police lines, so to speak, to get out of that end of the cul-de-sac and then get away, rushed out, opening fire. And in the course of maybe 30 seconds, something like 12 or 15 bullets were fired by the robbers. 3 police officers had fatal injuries, and 2 other were seriously injured and unable to ever return to police duties. There is a plaque which nearby which marks the spot. As I say, it was the worst single incident in the history of the London police. The robbers had also managed to shoot one of their own in the confusion. A guy called George Gardstein, badly injured, but not dead. So 2 of the robbers took him on their shoulder and walked him back to the East End as if he was a Friday night drunk. And because there were a lot of Friday night drunks, basically they weren't interrupted. They were spotted, but they weren't interrupted. That's a mourning card for the three officers, Sergeant Tucker, Sergeant Bentley and Constable Choate. Their funeral service was at St Paul's, and Winston Churchill attended, so there was a real sense of shock. Very occasionally there was armed violence at this time, but very, very few police casualties, and this was something that actually captured national attention and concern. And this is George Gardstein. So he was brought back to a room that the gang used in Whitechapel, probably half a mile or so from the scene of the robbery attempt in Houndsditch. The robbers basically dumped him on a bed there and ran, leaving two young women who were associates of the group but may not have known about the robbery attempt to look after a dying man. George Gardstein died the next morning. The police found his body late that morning, and it's the police that took these rather gruesome post-mortem photographs, which were circulated widely because they wanted to find out who the gang were, and this is the only face they had to go by. George Gardstein was almost certainly one of the people who had led the planning of the robbery attempt. This photograph was one of those found in his room. I can't be sure whether it's George Gardstein or somebody else, but the police commented what a tall and handsome man he was. And who the woman is, I don't know, but I'll let you into a secret, I don't think it's his sister. East End anarchists believed in free love. Actually, most of the anarchists led very conventional lives. So it was a notional belief in free love rather than an actual practice of it. The Latvians, on the other hand, practiced as well as believed in free love. So there were lots of fairly short relationships between comrades, and there were quite a few women in the group, even though the most active of the anarchists were men. By the way, under the mattress in which Gardstein's body was found, they found a powerful semi-automatic pistol and lots of ammunition and lots of documents. And also, as the police entered the room which had Gardstein's body, there was a woman associate who, even as they entered, was burning photographs and incriminating documents in the grate. She didn't stop until she was physically restrained. So after the robbery attempt, most of those who were most centrally involved got out of the country. It seems that Peter the Painter, who wasn't present at Houndsditch but certainly was involved, managed to get a boat across to Holland within a day or two. Another of the gang got a boat to France, probably the same night, certainly if not then the next night. Another managed to go to Antwerp. One of the women involved, Nina Vasileva, tried to get to Paris, but she was too spooked by the number of police on the streets and returned to her lodgings in the East End. So basically, if you were a key figure in the robbery attempt, you tried to get out of the country. But two of the gang, Fritz Spars and William Sokolov, hid nearer to hand. They hid in the room of Sokolov's lover, a woman called Betsy Gershon, who had a single room without any water on the second floor of 100 Sydney Street. And that's where they hid for 2 weeks. And it's amazing that they weren't noticed, but then if you believe you're facing the prospect of capital punishment, then you will keep a very low profile for as long as it takes. After a couple of weeks, the two Latvians thought, we need to find a better place to hide. We need to move. And they made contact indirectly with one of their comrades and said, find us somewhere else where we can hide. This comrade came to visit the two Latvians in their hiding place and said he would find them somewhere else. but he was an informer, and he told the police where the two men were hiding. More than that, Fritz Vars, one of the two men trapped in Sydney Street, had written a letter in Latvian to his family back in Riga. It says in part, 2 weeks I've been on the run, how much longer I can manage, I don't know. To leave soon doesn't bear thinking about because they're guarding all the roads intensely. I'm not at all depressed because everyone knows that one has to die at some time. So he seems to, come to terms with the prospect that he might not get away with it. He gave this handwritten letter to the person who was finding them somewhere else to hide to pass on to Latvia. That guy, as I mentioned, was an informer, so he passed on the letter to the police, and it remains in the City of London police files in the London Metropolitan Archive. This is, I photographed the original copy, spooky. And it never got back to its intended audience, which was the family in Latvia, until last October. One of those strange coincidences, the woman I was using to help me translate the little bits of Latvian inscription was selling a flat in Riga and having a conversation with her estate agent, it's the woman on the left. The estate agent said, oh, one of our forebears was one of these London rebels. So she reported back to me, I did a bit more digging. Margarita on the right, if you wonder why she's got chopsticks in her hand, I met her in a Chinese restaurant in Riga, is the great-granddaughter of the sister of Fritz Vars, who wrote the letter and then subsequently died in Sydney Street. I've checked out the story. They've got family Bibles with inscriptions and all sorts of evidence which convinces me that they are who they say they are, not that there's any particular kudos for pretending that you've got an anarchist gunman in your family. And I went to Latvia last October to give a copy of the letter to the family, the intended recipients. They were very pleased to have it. They're neither proud nor ashamed of their forebear. It's simply part of the story. Part of the story of Latvia as well as part of the story of their family. So on the night of the 2nd into the 3rd of January 1911, the police surrounded 100 Sydney Street, front and back. 20 of the police had very basic rifles and guns. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, a police constable went up and threw gravel at the second floor window where it was believed the two men were hiding. That was met by a volley of gunfire from inside the house. A police sergeant was badly injured, though survived, and that was the start of the shootout. Except the police discovered very quickly that they were outgunned. The Latvians had more powerful weapons, they had a higher vantage point, and they seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of ammunition. So by 10 o'clock, after 3 hours of this, the police asked permission to get the army involved. And they were given permission, and they went to the Tower of London, literally, to get 24 Scots Guards with rifles who marched through the streets of the East End to help in the operation against the two anarchists. And they opened fire, but virtually straight away to try to respond to fire, but also to kill the two gunmen. Soldiers had not opened fire in London in support of the police for almost a century before 1911. And as far as I can work out, it didn't happen again until the Iran embassy siege in 1980. So for a period of 160 years, this was, as far as I can make out, I mean, it's just such a staggering fact. I'm waiting for somebody to stand up and contradict it, but it hasn't happened yet. For 160 years, this was the only occasion when troops opened fire in the streets of London in support of the police. And there's Winston Churchill peering out from the entrance to a yard of a pub. This was circulated and sold very widely as a halfpenny postcard. What I really like is the guy that's sitting on the low roof above Churchill, waving at the camera. I'd really like to know his story. But as the drama dragged on to lunchtime and beyond, the authorities were very worried that actually it could last until nightfall, which they wanted to preempt. So, again, you just have to rub your eyes. The army brought in machine guns and stationed them on Sydney Street, and then they called on the artillery based in St John's Wood to bring horse-drawn field artillery, and either 2 or 3 large artillery guns were brought to Sydney Street. Neither the machine guns nor the artillery was used, but I think it's the only time they have been deployed on the streets of London. I just can't think of any other occasion. But what happened in the end is, after 6 hours of shooting, fairly persistent shooting, not incessant, but fairly persistent, burst from one side, a burst from the other, a few minutes of quiet, another burst. Some smoke was seen coming out of the second floor window at 100 Sydney Street. Within half an hour, that had turned into flames. The fire brigade turned up. Winston Churchill personally instructed the fire brigade not to attempt to douse the flames, to let the building burn. He said later that he didn't want the fire officers to risk their own lives, actually. But the first fire officers at the scene were told by police at the scene that the police were firing out burners, which gives the supposition that the police may have started the blaze. That was how it was initially reported, though the police subsequently denied that. We don't know, in essence, how the fire started. It could have been a smoke screen to try and, started by the Latvians to try and give them cover to escape. It could have been a fractured gas pipe in all the exchange of bullets. It could have been started by the police to hasten an end to the stand-up. We don't know. But the last bullets were fired round about 1:30. 2 o'clock, the fire brigade was allowed to start directing its hoses up the burning building. 2:30, the fire brigade entered at the rear of the building, which was then very badly burned. They immediately spotted one charred corpse on the ground. The other corpse was so charred that it took them several hours to realise that it was a corpse. Of the 2 gunmen, one died from a bullet wound, the other died of smoke suffocation. And it was a sensation. All the tabloid papers went for it. Daily Mirror the next morning, front page photograph, and inside 20 photographs from or about the siege of Sydney Street. The People published a cartoon which, most of the Latvians weren't Jewish, as I said, but they were seen to be from the Jewish East End. The cartoon, and the People is a mainstream paper, it's not a fringe paper, is poisonously anti-Semitic. It shows rats labelled undesirable alien with Semitic features being told to clear out of a foreign country and entering Britain through gaps in the Aliens Act. The Aliens Act had been introduced by a Conservative government in 1905 as the first and not very effective attempt to limit mass migration, immigration into the country. And the message of this is, it's the gaps in the Act that need to be closed up to stop undesirable immigrants entering the country. So, rather to their credit, the Liberal government thought about tightening immigration legislation. They thought about limiting the right of asylum for people who said they faced religious or political persecution, but actually they did nothing. And the only policy change after the siege of Sydney Street was to make available to London's police more effective firearms when they were dealing with armed crime, which is entirely sensible. And this is my last slide. So, the main perpetrators of the police murders had either fled the country or in one case, well, in 3 cases, were dead. Gardstein had been shot by his comrades and 2 had died in 100 Sydney Street. But the police were under huge pressure to prosecute the rest of the gang. And they staged a trial at the Old Bailey, which was not very successful. And Nina Vasileva, this is her arrest photograph, and look at the glower as she faces the police camera. I mean, you know, she's sort of, there's a real sort of, there's a force of personality there, as well as a sort of pent-up anger. She was the only person who was convicted arising from the police murders. She was convicted of conspiracy to rob, so not directly of involvement in the murders. She appealed, and she got off. So 6 weeks later, her appeal was successful. So basically, as a result of 3 police murders and the siege of Sydney Street, nobody had an enduring conviction. You could say she was lucky to get off, but what struck me going through the police records is there's no suggestion that even though police were dealing with men suspected of killing 3 of their colleagues, that anybody was roughed up, that anybody was verbalised. Some of the identity parades were a little bit dubious. I think the police were saying, "It's the one on the end," and things like that. But the court hearings were scrupulously fair, and the Lord Chief Justice described Vasileva as a respectable woman, even though she was absolutely clearly an anarchist, and indeed the lover of George Garnstein, who had been shot dead by his comrades. So, I mean, the benefit of the doubt was given to the defendants, which is the way it should be, but it's not always the way you expect it to be in cases of this sort. So that's the story. By the way, I'm going over, but just to say, the jury that convicted Vasileva added a rider, "Please don't deport her," and the judge agreed he would not recommend her for deportation. As a convicted criminal, she could have been deported. And the jury said that was because they feared that if she was sent back to Latvia, she would be imprisoned and probably killed. And they thought that was, well, they didn't want that to see that happen. In the 1920s, the authorities made another attempt to deport her because at that time she was working for Arcos, the Soviet trade delegation in London, and that was seen as a centre of espionage. So somebody in MI5 made the connection between, you know, the woman working for the Soviet trade delegation and the woman who